Rain pelted the cracked windshield of Noah's Ford F-150 with a relentless rhythm that felt like a countdown to my execution. "Get out," he said, his voice barely rising above the roar of the Pacific Northwest storm. I stared at him, my stepfather of 7 years, the man who had held my mother's hand on her deathbed, and promised he would look after me. I was 17 years old, shivering in a threadbare denim jacket, clutching a faded canvas duffel bag that contained 3 pairs of socks, 2 t-shirts, and exactly $42. We were idling by the curb of a desolate, flickering Exxon station on the rural outskirts of Clatsop County, Oregon. "Noah, please," I whispered, the words tasting like copper and ash in my mouth. "It's freezing out there. Where am I supposed to go?" He leaned over the center console, shoved the passenger door open, and pushed me hard by the shoulder. "Not my problem anymore, Chloe. You're practically an adult. Figure it out." Before I could find my footing on the wet gravel, the door slammed shut. The tires screeched against the slick asphalt, kicking up a spray of muddy water that soaked my jeans. I stood frozen under the dim, buzzing light of a broken street lamp, watching his red taillights bleed into the pitch-black, stormy night. My mother, Sarah, had been dead for 6 months. In that time, Noah had drained her small life insurance policy, sold her jewelry, and now finally disposed of me. The cold didn't just touch my skin, it seeped into my bones. The gas station attendant had locked the doors, a faded, closed sign hanging crookedly in the window. With no cell phone, Noah had canceled my plan weeks ago, and no destination, I started walking along Highway 101. Panic is a physical thing. It tightened my chest and made my breath short and ragged. I walked for what felt like hours, the rain soaking through my jacket, my sneakers sloshing with every step. I knew that if I didn't find shelter soon, hypothermia would take over. The dense Oregon woods loomed on either side of the highway, a wall of impenetrable black pines. Just past a bend near Saddle Mountain, my flashlight, a cheap plastic freebie I dug out of my bag, caught a break in the tree line. It wasn't a road, just a faint, overgrown logging trail choked with blackberry brambles. Desperation overrode my fear of the dark woods. I pushed through the thorns, the briars tearing at my jeans and scratching my hands. About half a mile off the highway, the beam of my flashlight hit something solid. Wood. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, sinking into the mossy earth. The roof was sagging, and the windows were boarded up tight. A heavy, rusted master lock secured the heavy oak front door. This place hadn't seen a human soul in decades. My hands were entirely numb, but survival instinct gave me a frantic kind of strength. I scoured the wet ground until I found a heavy piece of jagged river stone. I brought it down on the rusted padlock with everything I had. Once, twice. On the 7th strike, the metal housing cracked, and the shackle gave way. I pushed the door open, coughing as a cloud of stale, musty air rushed out to meet the damp night. I stumbled inside, kicked the door shut against the howling wind, and collapsed onto the dusty wooden floorboards. I was completely alone, abandoned, and broke. I curled into a tight ball, wrapped my arms around my knees, and cried until exhaustion dragged me into a fitful, shivering sleep. Morning broke with thin slices of gray light piercing through the cracks in the boarded windows. I woke up stiff, my throat raw, my stomach twisting with violent hunger cramps. I forced myself to stand, my damp clothes clinging to my skin, and began to inspect my refuge. The cabin was a single room. A rusted cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner, flanked by a rotting armchair and a heavy oak desk. Dust coated everything in a thick, velvety blanket. It looked as though whoever lived here had simply walked out one day and never returned. I began opening the desk drawers, hoping to find a forgotten can of soup, a matchbook, anything. The drawers were empty, save for some dried mouse droppings. Frustrated, I slammed the bottom drawer shut. Clack. The sound was hollow. Abnormal. I paused, dropping to my knees. I knocked my knuckles against the side of the desk, then against the floorboards directly beneath it. The wood around the desk sounded solid, but the 2 planks directly beneath the bottom drawer gave off a distinct hollow resonance. My heart began to race. I wedged my cold fingers into the seam between the planks. It took 10 minutes of broken fingernails and agonizing prying, but finally, the wood groaned and lifted. Hidden in the shallow cavity beneath the floor was a heavy olive green metal lockbox. It wasn't locked. The latch was stiff with disuse, but with a hard yank, it popped open. I fully expected to find hunting gear, old ammunition, or maybe just garbage. Instead, the box was neatly packed. On top lay 3 thick stacks of $20 bills, bound in brittle rubber bands. My breath caught in my throat. I touched the money, half expecting it to turn to dust. It was real, thousands of dollars. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life, certainly enough to get me a bus ticket anywhere and a hot meal. But it was what lay beneath the money that would alter the trajectory of my entire existence. There were stacks of yellowing handwritten letters, a thick leather-bound ledger, and a sealed legal envelope. I carefully unfolded the first letter. It was dated 15 years ago, addressed to my mother, Sarah Hastings. I scanned the cursive handwriting, my eyes widening with every line. My dear Sarah, if you are reading this, Noah has likely succeeded. I should never have trusted him with the company accounts. He has manipulated the books so thoroughly that I am facing federal indictment while he walks away with the entire Croft estate. He threatened you, Sarah. He threatened my little Chloe. That is why I had to disappear. I am leaving this evidence, the true ledgers, hidden at the old logging claim. Do not let him adopt her. Do not let him take what is rightfully hers when she turns 18. All my love, Silas Croft. I dropped the letter as if it were on fire. Silas Croft. Growing up, my mother had always told me my biological father was a drifter, a man who had abandoned us when I was a baby. Noah had stepped in, playing the role of the benevolent savior who took in the desperate single mother and her child. My hands shaking, I opened the heavy leather ledger. It was a meticulous record of financial transactions, offshore wire transfers, and forged signatures. It detailed exactly how Noah Sterling, who had been Silas Croft's lead accountant, had embezzled millions from Silas Logistics Company, framed my father for the fraud, and then swooped in to marry my mother, cementing his control over the remaining assets and ensuring she never asked questions. Then, I opened the sealed legal envelope. It was a last will and testament alongside a trust document. Silas Croft hadn't just left behind evidence, he had left a trust fund. Millions of dollars, legally bound and locked away, set to automatically transfer to his only heir, Chloe Hastings, on her 18th birthday. I stared at the wall of the cabin, the pieces of my life violently snapping into a horrifying new picture. Noah hadn't kicked me out because he was tired of me. He had kicked me out because my 18th birthday was exactly 3 weeks away. He knew that if I vanished, if I became just another runaway statistic on the Oregon coast, the trust would remain unclaimed, defaulting to my mother's estate, which he now controlled. He thought I was just a naive, broke teenager who would end up on the streets of Portland, or worse, dead in the woods. He didn't know I would stumble into the very cabin my father had used as his final hiding place. I spent the next 2 hours reading every single page. The fear that had paralyzed me on the highway evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharpened fury. I wasn't an abandoned burden. I was the heir to a stolen legacy, and the man who had tormented my mother, erased my father, and left me for dead was going to pay. I'd packed the money, the letters, the ledger, and the will into my canvas duffel bag. I wrapped them in my spare shirts to protect them from the damp. I zipped my threadbare jacket all the way up, stepped out of the cabin, and began the long walk back to the highway. I wasn't a victim looking for a warm place to hide anymore. I was a girl going to war. It took me 4 hours to hitchhike into Astoria. I didn't go to a diner. I didn't go to a motel. I walked straight into the Clatsop County Sheriff's Department. The warmth of the precinct hit me first, followed by the skeptical glare of the desk sergeant. I was shivering, covered in mud, with twigs tangled in my hair. I demanded to speak to a detective about a multi-million-dollar embezzlement and fraud case. They nearly threw me out, assuming I was a drug-addicted runaway. But I refused to leave. I sat on the hard wooden bench in the lobby and pulled out a stack of $20 bills and laid them on the counter. I have proof, I said, my voice steady despite my trembling hands. Get someone who investigates financial crimes. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Detective Thomas Miller. He was a weary-looking man in his 50s, holding a lukewarm cup of coffee, looking at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "All right, Chloe," Detective Miller sighed, clicking his pen. "You say your stepfather kicked you out. That's a domestic issue, maybe child abandonment since you're 17. But you're talking about corporate fraud. That's a big leap." Without a word, I unzipped my duffel bag. I placed Silas Croft ledger on the metal desk. Then the letters, then the will. "My stepfather is Noah Sterling," I said, looking him dead in the eye. 15 years ago, he framed my biological father, Silas Croft, and stole his company. He married my mother to keep the secret. Last night, he left me on the side of Highway 101 to die because in 3 weeks, I turn 18 and this trust fund kicks in. Miller picked up the ledger. His condescending demeanor vanished the moment he saw the columns of numbers and the clear, undeniable records of wire fraud. He read the first letter, from Silas. The air in the small interrogation room seemed to grow dense. He looked up at me, the pity replaced by intense, razor-sharp focus. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "Hidden in the woods," I replied, where he thought no one would ever look. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of foster care placements, FBI interviews, and forensic accountants. Detective Miller brought in federal agents once they realized the scale of Noah's offshore accounts. I was placed with my mother's sister, Aunt Beatrice Bea Gallagher, in Seattle. Bea had been alienated by Noah years ago, convinced by him that my mother wanted nothing to do with her. When Bea found out the truth, she took me in without hesitation, offering me the first real, safe home I'd had since I was a child. Noah never saw it coming. 2 days before my 18th birthday, Noah Sterling was sitting in the dining room of the waterfront house he had bought with my father's money, eating breakfast. He was likely patting himself on the back, assuming I was long gone and the money was securely his. Detective Miller led the raid. They kicked down the custom mahogany front door at 6:00 a.m. Noah was arrested in his silk bathrobe, screaming about a misunderstanding, right up until Miller held up a photocopy of Silas Croft's ledger. I wasn't there to see the cuffs go on, but Miller called me later that afternoon. "We got him, Chloe," Miller said over the phone, his voice rough with satisfaction. He tried to deny it that the paper trail in that ledger is airtight. The feds have frozen every asset he possesses. He's looking at 20 years minimum for the fraud alone, not counting the endangerment charges for what he did to you on the highway. I stood on the balcony of Aunt's apartment, looking out over the Seattle skyline. For the first time in my life, I took a deep breath that didn't feel restricted by fear or anxiety. "Thank you, Detective," I said. When I turned 18, the legal restraints dissolved. I officially inherited the Croft estate, the trust fund, and the remnants of the company my father had built. The money was staggering, but it wasn't what mattered to me. What mattered was that the narrative had been corrected. My mother hadn't married a savior. She had been trapped by a monster. My father wasn't a deadbeat who ran away. He was a man who sacrificed everything, including his own freedom and life, to leave behind a weapon I could use to save myself. I never found out exactly what happened to Silas Croft after he wrote those letters. The authorities presume he passed away off the grid, unable to return to society without facing the charges Noah had laid at his feet. But I used his money to buy the land in Clatsop County. I hired contractors to clear the logging road and restore the little cabin in the woods. I didn't make it a mansion. I kept it simple, strong, and secure. It stands today as a quiet monument to a man I never got to know, but who saved my life from beyond the grave. Would it work if them again? Winter bursts the windows and the Oregon wind howls through the pines. I sit by the warm cast-iron stove, drinking tea, safe in the knowledge that no one will ever lock me out in the cold again.